Steven Spielberg is not simply a filmmaker. He is an architect of modern imagination, a man who has spent more than 50 years constructing worlds that make audiences weep, gasp, laugh, and wonder. From the mechanical terror of a great white shark to the thundering chaos of Normandy's beaches, from the dust-blown temples of ancient civilizations to the quiet dignity of a president navigating the bloodiest chapter in American history, Spielberg has done something no algorithm or formula can replicate. He has made people feel profoundly, consistently, and unforgettably. But behind every great director is a roster of performers who carry the vision forward, who take words on a page and transform them into something living and irreplaceable. Over the course of his legendary career, Spielberg has worked with hundreds of talented actors. Yet there are 6 who occupy a different kind of space in his memory, his creative philosophy, and his heart. These are not merely favorites by popularity or box office reward. These are the performers who, in Spielberg's own estimation, changed the way he understood storytelling, collaboration, and the mysterious alchemy between a director's vision and an actor's soul. Let us meet them. Harrison Ford. There are actors who fit a role, and then there are actors who define one so completely that it becomes impossible to imagine anyone else inhabiting that space. Harrison Ford belongs entirely to the second category. When Steven Spielberg cast Ford as Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981, he wasn't simply filling a part. He was igniting one of cinema's most enduring creative partnerships. What Spielberg has always admired most about Ford is not the swagger or the iconic silhouette in that battered fedora, though those elements are undeniably magnetic. It is the man's extraordinary commitment to authenticity. Ford approaches filmmaking with the seriousness of a craftsman who takes genuine pride in his work. He doesn't posture or perform for the gallery. He shows up, he prepares meticulously, and he delivers with a quiet, almost stubborn consistency that Spielberg has described as utterly dependable. On the Indiana Jones productions, Ford was known to insist on performing his own stunts whenever physically possible. This wasn't recklessness. It was a deeply held belief that the camera can detect dishonesty, that audiences, even unconsciously, can tell the difference between a performer fully committed to a moment and one who has handed that moment to someone else. That philosophy aligned perfectly with Spielberg's own obsession with earned emotion, with moments that feel genuinely lived rather than technically manufactured. Beyond the physical commitment, Ford brings something rarer to a set. He brings grounded, masculine vulnerability. Indiana Jones is not an invincible superhero. He bleeds, he panics, he makes miscalculations, and he occasionally gets things spectacularly wrong. That humanity, that carefully calibrated imperfection, is Ford's greatest gift. Spielberg has always understood that audiences don't fall in love with perfection. They fall in love with recognizable human struggle dressed in extraordinary circumstances. Harrison Ford embodies that principle better than almost anyone in cinema history. Daniel Day-Lewis. If Harrison Ford represents the ideal of cinematic reliability and grounded humanity, Daniel Day-Lewis represents something altogether more extraordinary and, in Spielberg's own telling, something that bordered on the supernatural. When Spielberg finally persuaded Day-Lewis to portray Abraham Lincoln in the 2012 biographical drama of the same name, the result was not merely a great performance. It was a complete transformation, so total and so convincing that Spielberg himself has admitted to moments of genuine disorientation on set. Day-Lewis is the living embodiment of total immersion. His preparation for Lincoln was so exhaustive, so painstakingly thorough, that by the time principal photography began, the man who arrived on set each morning was not recognizably Daniel Day-Lewis. He was something else entirely. Spielberg, a director of enormous confidence, who has always maintained firm creative control over his productions, found himself instinctively stepping back, allowing a kind of reverential space around Day-Lewis that he grants to almost no one. Spielberg has spoken openly about addressing Day-Lewis as Mr. President throughout the production, and importantly, this was not a theatrical affectation or a publicity stunt. It was an organic response to the reality Day-Lewis had constructed around himself. The atmosphere demanded it. The performance demanded it. And Spielberg, perhaps more than anyone on that set, understood what was happening, and chose to honor it. The collaboration had not been easy to arrange. Day-Lewis famously guards his professional choices with extreme care, accepting only roles that genuinely call to him on some deep personal level. He had declined Spielberg's approaches on previous occasions, and the director's willingness to wait, to remain patient across years of gentle persuasion, speaks to how completely he believed in the match. When the Academy Award for Best Actor followed, it validated not just Day-Lewis's performance, but Spielberg's conviction that only this particular actor could have made Lincoln breathe again. Tom Hanks. If Daniel Day-Lewis represents the outer limit of transformative acting, Tom Hanks represents something equally valuable, but differently expressed. He represents trustworthiness at the highest possible level. Spielberg and Hanks have built one of the most celebrated director-actor partnerships in Hollywood history, a creative alliance spanning multiple decades and multiple masterworks, including Saving Private Ryan, Catch Me If You Can, The Terminal, Bridge of Spies, and The Post. What Spielberg values most in Hanks is something that sounds deceptively simple, but is, in practice, extraordinarily rare. Tom Hanks makes you believe him completely, not because he is theatrical or technically flamboyant, but because he possesses an almost molecular authenticity, a fundamental decency and intelligence that radiates from the screen with no apparent effort. He is the everyman elevated, the ordinary person placed inside extraordinary circumstances and responding with the kind of measured, recognizable humanity that Spielberg has always found most cinematically powerful. On Saving Private Ryan, one of the most demanding and emotionally grueling productions in Spielberg's career, Hanks served as a stabilizing force both on screen and off. Captain Miller is not a man who conquers war. He is a man who endures it, who carries its terrible weight quietly, who allows his soldiers to believe in his strength precisely because he has learned to disguise his own fractures. That performance required extraordinary internal discipline, and Hanks delivered it with such apparent effortlessness that audiences and critics sometimes underestimated the technical mastery involved. Spielberg has noted repeatedly that working with Hanks feels less like directing and more like collaborating with someone who understands the story at the same molecular level he does. There is a shared language between them, an unspoken alignment of values and intentions that makes the filmmaking process feel genuinely collaborative rather than hierarchical. Leonardo DiCaprio. When Spielberg cast Leonardo DiCaprio in Catch Me If You Can in 2002, DiCaprio was at an interesting crossroads in his career. He had achieved global superstardom through Titanic 5 years earlier, but serious cinematic credibility, the kind that comes from genuinely complex, demanding roles, remained something he was still actively pursuing. Spielberg saw past the heartthrob persona immediately and recognized something that others were slower to appreciate. He saw a genuinely exceptional technical actor with remarkable emotional intelligence and an internal discipline far beyond his years. Frank Abagnale Jr., the real-life con artist DiCaprio portrayed, is one of the more deceptively complex characters in Spielberg's filmography. On the surface, Abagnale appears charming, confident, and almost invincibly resourceful. But beneath that gleaming exterior lives a profoundly lonely young man, desperate for his father's approval, terrified of genuine human connection, and constantly outrunning a sadness he cannot quite name. DiCaprio understood that the charm was the defense mechanism, not the character itself, and he played those two dimensions simultaneously with a precision that genuinely impressed Spielberg. Spielberg has described DiCaprio as possessing an internal clock, a natural instinct for pace and timing that cannot be taught. He doesn't arrive at moments through calculation alone. He arrives through something more intuitive, a felt sense of where a scene is going and exactly when to land its emotional note. That quality, combined with DiCaprio's fierce preparation and intellectual curiosity, made him an ideal collaborator for a director who prizes authenticity above almost everything else. Those subsequent planned collaborations between Spielberg and DiCaprio never fully materialized. The mutual admiration has remained consistent and public. Spielberg has spoken warmly about DiCaprio's later performances, recognizing in each one the same qualities he first identified on the set of Catch Me If You Can. The promise of a second collaboration between them remains one of cinema's most intriguing, unfinished conversations. Meryl Streep. Steven Spielberg waited nearly 4 decades to direct Meryl Streep. When the opportunity finally arrived with The Post in 2017, it carried the particular weight of long-deferred anticipation. Streep, who came to the role of Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham as one of the most decorated and respected actresses in the history of American cinema, brought something that immediately struck Spielberg as both thrilling and, by his own admission, slightly intimidating. Streep's approach to Graham was meticulous in ways that complemented Spielberg's own directorial instincts perfectly. She did not simply research the historical figure or study archival footage, though she certainly did both. She went further, locating the psychological interior of a woman who had spent much of her life underestimating herself because powerful men around her had spent years encouraging that underestimation. The arc of Graham's self-realization, her gradual discovery of her own authority and conviction, was something Streep rendered with extraordinary subtlety. She let the audience watch a woman learn to trust herself in real time, and she did it largely through what she chose not to show. Spielberg has spoken about directing Streep with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine humility. He recognized early in production that his primary creative task was not to guide her toward the performance, but to construct the optimal conditions for her to deliver it. He trusted her instincts completely, gave her the space that her process required, and found that the collaboration produced some of the most quietly powerful sequences in his later career. The relationship between Spielberg and Streep on The Post represents something significant in both their careers. It is the meeting of two artists at the height of their respective powers, each bringing decades of accumulated craft and wisdom to a story that genuinely demanded both. Robin Williams. Of all 6 actors Spielberg names among his favorites, Robin Williams is perhaps the most personally significant. Their collaboration on Hook in 1991 was, by most accounts, a difficult production. It was ambitious to the point of being unwieldy, logistically complex, chronically behind schedule, and creatively frustrating in ways that tested Spielberg's considerable patience and resilience. Yet out of that challenging experience emerged something that Spielberg has never entirely stopped talking about, not because the film was perfect, but because Robin Williams was. Williams brought to the role of the grown-up Peter Pan a quality that is almost impossible to manufacture artificially. He brought genuine, unguarded, emotional availability. Peter Banning, the man who has forgotten he was once Peter Pan, is a character built around loss. The loss of imagination, of playfulness, of the child's instinctive belief in the impossible. Williams inhabited that loss with a completeness that surprised even Spielberg, who had anticipated the comedian's energy, but perhaps not the depth of feeling he was equally capable of expressing. Off-camera, Williams became something equally important. During the most grueling stretches of production, he made it his personal mission to sustain Spielberg's spirits. He would call the director in the evenings, not to discuss the film, not to raise concerns or negotiate, but simply to be present and to make him laugh. 15 minutes of pure improvised joy offered freely, without agenda, without ego. For Spielberg, those calls were genuinely restorative. They reminded him of why storytelling matters, why humor is not trivial but profound, why the ability to bring genuine laughter to another human being is one of the most significant gifts a person can offer. When Robin Williams died in August 2014, Spielberg's grief was public and unconcealed. He spoke about Williams not merely as a collaborator, but as someone who had altered his understanding of what human beings can be for one another. The warmth, the generosity, the extraordinary vitality of the man, these were not performance. They were character. And character, Spielberg has always believed, is ultimately what both great acting and great cinema are made of. 6 actors. 6 entirely different artistic personalities, 6 different approaches to the craft, 6 different kinds of gifts offered to a director whose life's work has been to show us ourselves more clearly. Harrison Ford gave Spielberg reliability and grounded heroism. Daniel Day-Lewis gave him transcendence. Tom Hanks gave him trust and emotional truth. Leonardo DiCaprio gave him precision and promise. Meryl Streep gave him mastery and revelation. And Robin Williams gave him something perhaps most rare of all. He gave him joy. What unites all six, beneath their obvious differences, is a shared commitment to honesty in performance, to the belief that the camera sees through pretense and rewards only genuine human truth. That commitment mirrors Spielberg's own deepest artistic conviction, which is why, across 50 years and dozens of extraordinary films, these are the performers who live most permanently in his memory and his gratitude. Cinema, at its finest, is a conversation between a director's vision and an actor's humanity. Steven Spielberg has been fortunate enough to have that conversation at the very highest level, with six of the greatest artists the screen has ever known. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.